Hello, and thanks for tuning in to Ukraine Update with John Moran. I'm your host, Finbar Markey. Every week I'm joined by John Moran, former head of the foreign desk for the Irish Press, and we look at updates from the Ukraine war, but also some other international stories as well. John gives us a prologue or an update himself for a couple of minutes, and from there we discuss those matters further. Thanks for joining us again this week, John.
My pleasure, Finbar.
And what have you got for us?
Well, with the Ukrainian offensive now into its third week, and despite intensive fighting on many points along the front lines, there have been few successful Ukrainian advances other than marginal ones in a few small villages in the Zaporizhia and Donetsk provinces. Ukraine's President Zelensky said the offensive had been slower than desired. Quote, some people believe this is a Hollywood movie and expect results now. It's not, he added. Into the third week of the offensive, Ukrainian forces have as yet not even reached the first line of the Russian defense anywhere along the front. Because of this failure, and because of massive losses in men and material that Ukraine has suffered in the first 2 weeks, some observers have already begun labeling the entire offensive a failure. Ukrainian forces have been unable to use their new Leopard and Bradleys in any large numbers without suffering severe losses due to Russian attacks on tank convoys with mines, drones, aircraft, heavy artillery, and especially helicopters. Russia has almost total dominance in the air. In particular, the Russian Alligator helicopters have been cited by the Financial Times as a key factor in blocking the Ukrainian offense due to their effectiveness against tanks, other armored vehicles, and troop concentrations. Fierce fighting has been reported in the Orokovo region of Zaporizhia, in particular in the tiny village of Paitaktika. Russia has claimed to have knocked out scores of armored vehicles in this area, including tanks and troop carriers. Paitaktika has changed hands several times. Latest reports have it in Russian hands. Russian bloggers have taken to calling this area Bradley Square due to the large number of Bradley US fighting machines put out of action here. On the Donetsk front, the Veremsky salient is another hotly contested sector, with Russian troops also fighting to take control of the towns of Mariupol and Avdiivka. Fighting is also taking place to the south of Bakhmut, near the town of Klishivka, which is held by Russian forces. There are reports also of heavy fighting in the town of Kremenaya in Luhansk. Reports are also coming in of Russian troop movements towards the town of Kupiansk in northern Kharkiv. As the Ukrainian offensive has begun to lose momentum, Ukraine has complained that many of the weapons and tanks donated to them have technical faults and can be used only for spare parts. In some places, Ukrainian forces have started to replace the large armored attacks with nighttime attacks by companies of troops. However, Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar said, quote, the biggest blow, unquote, in Kiev's offensive campaign against Russian forces has yet to come, but admitted that the operation is difficult as Moscow is throwing all it can into the battle. Overnight, Russian forces launched massive strikes on targets across Ukraine. In Lviv, the HQ of the Ukrainian secret police, the SBU, was hit, while several Ukrainian army targets were also targeted in Zaporizhia. EU states to donate €50 billion to Ukraine. Meanwhile, in London today, representatives of the UK, the US, and the EU have pledged billions more to Ukraine for post-war reconstruction at the Ukraine Recovery Conference, which is a 2-day event. On behalf of the EU, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has committed to giving a massive €50 billion aid package, saying, quote, "This plan could become an anchor for all international donors. This is what I mean when I say we are with Ukraine for as long as it takes." The €50 billion package must be approved, however, by all 27 EU member states. The US announced a package of 1.3 million in additional economic aid. The US has delivered more than 20 billion economic development assistance to Ukraine, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said, as well as 2.1 billion in humanitarian aid. The US is also the single biggest contributor of military aid. Britain committed to a package that includes 240 million of direct economic assistance and 3 billion in World Bank loan guarantees. Blinken's trip to London comes after his meeting on Monday with Chinese leader Xi Jinping. Blinken described 2 days of talks with Chinese diplomats as, quote, "candid, substantive, and constructive," unquote, while acknowledging the two sides had, quote, "profound differences," unquote. These profound differences were highlighted later when giving a speech in California. President Biden described President Xi as a dictator, which has undone much of the diplomacy Mr. Blinken had undertaken in Beijing. In response, China's foreign ministry spokesman accused President Biden of, quote, "political provocation," unquote, adding that Biden's comments had, quote, "seriously violated China's political dignity," unquote. Biden filed peace plan for Ukraine, says Putin. While meeting with the African peace delegation in St. Petersburg, President Putin revealed that a peace agreement had been agreed between Russia and the Ukrainian delegation in Istanbul last March that would have led to a neutral Ukraine with guarantees from Russia. "Here it is, it exists," said President Putin, showing the document signed by the Ukrainian delegation, quote, "and it's called accordingly the Treaty of Permanent Neutrality and Security Guarantees for Ukraine," unquote, he said. However, as soon as Russia withdrew troops from Kiev as a sign of Moscow's good faith, Ukraine's, quote, "Western masters," unquote, broke their promise, he said. Some viewers may remember Boris Johnson making a surprise visit to President Zelensky in Kiev, reportedly to inform him President Biden did not want Ukraine to proceed with the peace agreement. Since then, at least 300,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. Julian Assange is set to be deported from Britain. The extradition of Julian Assange from Belmarsh High Security Prison in England to a US prison is imminent, according to reports. His appalling treatment by the British state was critical to the virtual surrender of Western MSM journalists, which can be seen in their abysmal failure to properly cover the war in Ukraine, meekly handing over agency to the Ukrainian press office in Kiev. Huge pro-neutrality meeting in Dublin. Hundreds of anti-war supporters gathered in Liberty Hall in Dublin this week to protest over the government plan for a controversial forum on neutrality. Speakers railed against the number of listed speakers for the forum with direct and indirect connection to NATO. The proposed forum will be chaired by a dame of the British Empire, whose academic speciality is terrorism. The atmosphere in Liberty Hall for the meeting was electric throughout the evening. Some speakers called for protests against the Irish government's neutrality forum. Liberty Hall is the location of Irish Labour protests against involvement in the First World War under the banner of "We serve neither king nor Kaiser, but Ireland."
That was a great overview, John, of both of what's happening in Ukraine over the last week and some world developments as well. In terms of the Ukrainian offensive or counter-offensive or whatever language you want to do, I'm still reading reports over the last 48 hours from some Western sources that say that everything is going great. Ukraine is winning. Everything's fine. The offensive or the counter-offensive is a success. What's the real story here, John?
Well, that goes back to what I was saying to you about Julian Assange and Western mainstream journalists who have handed agency over to the press office in Kiev. They merely report anything they're told by Ukraine. So it's no surprise when these reports are at variance what is clearly happening on the ground.
Yeah. I saw some footage coming out from the southern the Ukrainian offensive, or the southern battle lines. And it was a village, this toing and froing that we discussed over the last couple of weeks about the counter-offensive, where the Russians would appear to facilitate the Ukrainians to come towards them. They'd allow them to take some territory, and then they'd blow the living crap out of them, and they'd take that territory again. But there was one village or very small town in which this was happening over and back. But the Russians decided to put an end to it by flattening the entire town with a massive artillery assault. And that's what the Ukrainians are facing again and again, isn't it, John? Just massive artillery assaults, limited losses from the Russian side, so we've been told, but really serious losses, up to 10,000 so far personnel and 250 tanks, Putin is saying. Thousands of armored personnel vehicles. Do you think that Ukraine has the resources? You said last week that you felt they still had a bit of fight left. Do you think at this stage they have the resources to achieve their goals?
I do. I still think it's too early to write them off. I mean, they have a huge army and they'd have at least 40,000 troops in reserve to add to any of the battlefronts that they need. So until that reserve is eaten away, they'll have enough to keep them going and, as they would hope, to make some breakthrough.
Yeah. The impact on the soldiers on the ground is quite severe. I have a short video here of, it seems to be in a trench, a Ukrainian trench on the battle lines, and there's one guy in particular who will take the focus of any viewers because he's literally having a nervous breakdown in front of his comrades that are filming. One of them is filming him. But if you look at and we'll play this twice so that you get a good view of it. But if you look in the eyes of the soldiers behind him, and one young soldier in particular, the absolute fear and anxiety that you can see in his eyes. He's not having a nervous breakdown, he's not screaming or shouting around, but just when you look in his eyes. So we'll look at this video twice and then we'll come back.
Тихо, 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 братан. Свои, серый. Хорошо, молодец. Серый. Свои. Он сознание теряет. Контузия, сознание теряет. Тихо, братан. Свои, серый. Хорошо, молодец.
John, what do you make of that video?
Oh, it's horrendous. I mean, this could probably be one of those guys you see getting dragged into vans all over Ukraine who didn't want to be there in the first place. And as soon as they arrive, they're introduced to the horror of war, with people losing limbs beside them that he had spoken to perhaps only moments earlier. This is beyond belief for any ordinary person to come into that. So it's not unusual at all for this guy to be having this severe panic attack.
When was the last time this kind of thing was seen in Europe? World War II, probably.
Or maybe back to one. It'd be more familiar in World War I think.
We were talking about figures bandied about of 300,000 Ukrainian dead. We were talking about that a couple of months ago at this stage. The figure must be 350. maybe more.
Or higher. I try to be a little bit conservative so as not to make any errors. But I do believe personally that it is far higher than that. I mean, the key element here is if people knew how many Ukrainians were dying in this operation, and if they knew that they didn't have a chance of winning and that many, many more are going to die, and these calls for not freezing the conflict means that they will continue to die.
Yeah. But there are winners in this, aren't there, John? You have the military arsenal companies. So you have the big conglomerates that produce the missiles, produce the tanks, all that kind of stuff. They are quids in on this, and their orders are for 5-10 years time. They're all booked up. There's also BlackRock and companies like that who seem to have literally bought up a lot of Ukraine's land, agricultural land, a lot of the contracts for rebuilding. And it seems that there are a lot of companies in the West who are rubbing their hands together with the idea that they're going to get that 50 billion that you were talking about. And that's, to my mind, that 50 billion from the EU is only a start. It's only opening up the thin edge of the wedge, as they say, to milk money from Europe over the next 10 to 15 years, reconstruction money, which will go into a lot of back pockets. I think if we look at what happened in Iraq with Halliburton and other companies, we can see that one of the objectives of war is to create destruction, so that it has to be rebuilt. And that rebuilding costs money, and certain companies always benefit from that. Would you agree with that assessment, John, that there are some winners in this?
Oh, I would, absolutely. I mean, BlackRock and Raytheon, for example, those two are likely to make an absolute fortune. And BlackRock, for instance, would have an interest in Russia losing. So they have no interest in any peace agreement, because a lot of the land that they have purchased will be in areas that Russia is about to take over.
Yeah, well, that was a bit foolish on their part, then, wasn't it? Just on the subject of reconstruction, Russia is in a process of reconstruction in the war zones that we were focused on this time last year, such as Mariupol. And we have a video here from a UK journalist called Johnny Miller, and he visited Mariupol this week, and he just was talking about the levels of reconstruction and the capacity that Russia has shown to reconstruct. Now, we've all seen and we all recall the footage that was coming out of the absolute destruction of Mariupol, or large parts of Mariupol. We'll have a look at this video now, and we'll come back in a wee minute.
So I'm here in Mariupol. It's quite incredible to be here. I was here about a year ago, just after the Russians took it. Much of the city destroyed, some of the neighborhoods resembling a post-apocalyptic wastelands, but I'm in the center right now, and it's quite bizarre to be here. Behind me, a newly installed fountain, a new park here, a playground behind me, and there is the drama theater, which was largely destroyed, but that's now got a huge perimeter built around it as they prepare to rebuild it. And it's a bizarre scene. I've spoken to a few people around, asked them, they're out in the playground with their kids eating ice cream. I've asked them, do they want to be, first of all, are they worried about the counter-offensive? They don't seem to be very worried here. People in the front, near the front line areas certainly are, but here people don't seem to be concerned. And I asked them whether they wanted to be liberated by Ukraine. Everybody I've spoken to so far just smiles and shakes their head and say no, that life is good here. They can go to the playgrounds, they can start work again, and they just want a peaceful life.
So that was Johnny Miller, a British journalist, filming from Mariupol a few days ago. John, I've seen video footage of some of the rebuilding of the apartment blocks in Mariupol. Footage that was coming out 6 months ago. And we hear about this notorious capacity for Russia to be able to produce military hardware and weaponry and things like that. But this is another side of Russia that we're seeing, their capacity to rebuild entire civic and urban areas in the space of 6 months to a year. It's just phenomenal, isn't it?
It is extraordinary. I mean, the sites around Mariupol that you see now are incredible. The reconstruction of the housing, the playgrounds and schools, they've done an extraordinary job there. They got straight into it and got stuck in to show this is what we're going to do. and they've done it.
Yeah, and one of the dangers is that if the counteroffensive was successful, we'll see all that reconstruction destroyed again. And I think it's I just on the other side, when the companies like BlackRock try to do reconstruction and other companies in Western Ukraine, or areas that were damaged by the Russians, which is mainly in Russian areas, to be honest with you. But if there is reconstruction to happen in Western Ukraine by the EU companies and American companies, I just wonder how fast that will happen and how much that will cost. Because I believe one of the objectives of war for these profiteers of war is to create all that destruction so that they can milk as much money and profit out of reconstruction as possible. We've seen that in Iraq.
Yeah, well, we've seen BlackRock buy up large percentages of Ukrainian farms. In particular, I've seen a figure of 17% of Ukrainian land being bandied about, which is an enormous amount of property.
And they talk about wanting independence and sovereignty, but they're actually selling themselves out to these massive global corporations. And again, Ukraine has been used as the plaything and the prototype or the pilot for this whole new digitally integrated life of the civilian. I can't remember exactly what to call it now, but everything has been digitized. So all those things that are being resisted in other countries are being brought in willy-nilly, and 110% worth of them into Ukraine as an experimental zone for all of these new social constructs. So we'll keep an eye on that as well, John. We have a video here. We spoke about resistance to conscription earlier on, or there was a comment made about it. And we regularly show videos on the program of people who are being forcibly conscripted into the Ukrainian army against their will, and that trying to indicate or trying to counter Western narratives and stories that, this is a glorious war, that all Ukrainians fighting want to fight. They're scraping the bottom of the barrel in terms of getting people to fight and conscripting people from what we can see in the evidence that we've actually produced on this show week after week. Here's another example where a conscription team was resisted by one guy who puts up some resistance. We'll have a look at this and we'll come back in a wee minute. Oh, John, that guy's head must still be thumping after being hit by that rock. What do you make of that? He's a brave fella,
He was, and he was only a little fella compared to the big fella who was trying to catch him. But he had no fear. He threw two big rocks at the guy and appears to have gotten away, which is unique. I haven't seen that before.
Well, I guess in a way, what is he going to do? I saw a video a couple of weeks ago of a guy who was on top of a building, and he was, rather than being sent to the front lines, conscripted to be sent to the front lines, he was willing to throw himself off the top of this building. And they got him down eventually. He was actually trying to do it. They were pulling him back while he was trying to throw, rather than get sent to the front lines. And so on the one hand, we might see this guy's reaction to the conscription team is a bit extreme, walloping him across the head with a rock and putting up such resistance. But the alternative is to be put in a position like we saw earlier with those guys in that trench. And that's the alternative. So I don't think his reaction was over the top when you consider what that alternative is.
Well, there's another point to it as well. There was a case during the week where the Ukrainians were complaining that the Russians released some prisoners from Transcarpathia. They were Hungarian of origin, and they wanted to go to Hungary and not to Ukraine. So the Russians send them to Hungary, and the Ukrainians are complaining. But the Hungarians have been saying that they have been singled out for military service in Transcarpathia, and that other regions aren't hit as heavily.
Right. Okay. So they're sending Ukrainians to the front first, and we've heard lots of reports like that. Though I have to say, in terms of balance and things like that, and picking people to go into the front, the Wagner group in Bakhmut, or Artyomovsk as it is called now, the Wagner group admitted to sending volunteer convicts into the danger zones first before their own permanent members. And so it has happened on both sides. I believe that in the Wagner case, the Russian government was a bit shocked by the numbers of the convict volunteers that were being killed, and they put a stop to it in terms of what Wagner were doing. But it does look, from reports that are coming out, both Hungarians and Russian speakers, ethnic Russians who've been conscripted, have been sent up to the front first. So that's something to watch out for as well. John, we've got two quick stories to look at before the end of the show. We're running tight on time. The next story, I'm going to show two videos, and they are videos of the attacks by Israeli settlers in a town or a village called Termers Aya in Palestine. And these attacks are part of a campaign that is being labeled or being called the price tag campaign. In other words, if Palestinian militants allegedly conduct an attack, and who knows who's thrown a homemade rocket anywhere, it could be anybody. But if there's allegations that it's Palestinian militants throwing rockets into Israel or onto Israeli targets, that they have this price tag campaign where they take it out on Palestinian citizens and civilians. They attack them, they burn down their villages. We'll look at these videos, we'll come back in a wee moment.
المساعية مولع فيها دور كثير يا جماعة الخير وفيها صوت طخ.
Up until the election of this new extremist element within the new Israeli government, John, we thought things couldn't get much worse for the Palestinian people. But now we're watching video footage coming out that we're not seeing on mainstream or corporate news at all, in which things like this price tag campaign, which is the pogrom and the persecution of innocent Palestinian men, women, and children, ultimately to take their land from them and take their belongings from them. And we know where this happened before. What do you take about this escalation, John?
It's horrendous. I mean, if you start allowing members of the public to, quote, take the law into their own hands, you're into a barbaric situation. It's bad enough having to live in Palestine as a Palestinian without having to endure that sort of behavior, that fascist behavior from the majority population.
Yeah. And the American administration has said that they're concerned about developments in Israel, but they have more influence and power on what happens in Israel than any other state in the world. And yet they're just concerned, but they're not doing anything about it. And that's one of the problems. In the Irish Republic, the vice prime minister, if you want to call him that, what we call the Taoiseach, made a statement over the last 24 hours in which he used language that inferred that when Israelis are killed, that it is shocking. And yet when Palestinians are killed, it's alarming. And the choice of language, somebody wrote that and chose those words. Maybe it was a slight, but it looks in Irish media and on Irish Twitter, a lot of people are very upset about that choice of language. Did you notice that, John, the language that is shocked when an Israeli gets killed and just alarmed when a Palestinian?
Well, it's always been the case with mainstream media and Israel and Palestine, the language that is used. If you get a bunch of young fellas throwing stones at soldiers, and a couple of them are shot dead, they're described as having been killed in clashes with Israelis. Now, a clash between an armed man and a boy with a stone is not what I would call a clash. That's straightforward murder.
Yeah, and it's just ongoing. But with the election of this far right element, some people might consider the Israeli government, when it comes to Palestine, far right anyway. But this new far right element led by Ben Gvir, with this development about 6 months ago, things have got a lot worse, and it's really hard to tell where it's going, because we've also seen increased attacks by Israel within Syria. And that's happened again this week. There's been a number of attacks by Israeli forces in Syria. Syria is not attacking Israel, but Israel is attacking Syria. So there seems to be this free-for-all happening, and it's worsening. It's not getting any better. It's worsening. John, on a final story, something that you mentioned earlier about this campaign to protect Irish neutrality on the one hand.
Oh, yes.
And then on the other hand, this campaign to abandon Irish neutrality and to get Ireland to join NATO and to join EU militarism. And this alter campaign has been conducted by members of the government, members of the Green Party. In fact, the Green Party itself, which seems to have become the corporate military voice of politics in Ireland to a degree, and also a plethora of journalists and people who might be considered to be the glitterati of Irish media or corporate media. They are campaigning to abandon neutrality, to join NATO, and all of those kind of things. We'll just have a look at this headline, John, for a wee second. For Michael D, who's the Irish president, Ireland is playing with fire in dangerous drift towards NATO. So this is the story that has got the Irish president in so much trouble from the glitterati and from the governing elements of politics in Ireland. But there's also been a massive show of support for Michael D. Higgins in what he said. What's your take on this story, John?
Well, I was down at that meeting in Liberty Hall on Monday, and the meeting was electric, fantastic response, and some great contributions from the floor, a full house. And the feeling at the end of it was we should move this onto the street and have a demonstration. I think there will be people protesting outside the Dublin Castle during its first meeting in Dublin. So that would be very interesting.
And this meeting, this is a civic forum that the government have organised to consult with the people in relation to Irish neutrality, and no doubt joining NATO as well. The government chose a dame of the British Empire to chair this process and to also finalise the report on this process. The Irish opposition, or certain elements within the Irish opposition, have accused the organisers of this civic forum of stacking it with NATO employees and agents and supporters, and I would agree with that to a large degree myself. There have been calls by some of the left opposition in Ireland to actually ignore and indeed boycott this civic forum. Do you believe that's the right way to go, John?
Well, personally, I would agree with anything that would put an end to that nonsense. Yeah, Leo Varadkar has said in the Dáil that he's not looking for an end to Ireland's neutrality or to join NATO. Well, then what's this nonsense all about? This proves what he's saying is a lie, because this is all about trying to shoehorn us into NATO by the ruse of pretending that it's meeting the people and hearing their voices. That's not what they're doing at all. It's the reverse. They're pumping the pro-NATO message into the people.
Yeah. I also note Phoenix magazine had a report out today in which they were looking at the planning process and how people would have a voice and been able to speak at these events and to try to put forward the case for neutrality. And it looks like there were steps taken to prevent groups and organizations from becoming involved if they had a pacifist stance on things. So it does look like it's stacked. I know, as you said, there's going to be protests outside. I know some people want to go into it so that they can voice their opposition both to joining NATO and abandoning neutrality, but also voice their opposition to the style and the nature and the planning of this so-called consultation process. So if people can check out when those things are happening, they're happening in Galway, Cork and Dublin. If you can get down to it, if you're deciding that you're not going to boycott it, but you want to give your voice, get down there and give your voice and be strong about it and video it and get that out there, because we know from polls that at least 75% of the Irish people, if not more, are completely in favour of retaining our neutrality, to the extent that the mainstream media or the corporate media are so upset. There was one newspaper article in one of the mainstream Irish newspapers over the last few days, which said that 59% of people supported joining NATO, and that was a drop. But in reality, it was actually 59% of the 14% of people that supported abandoned neutrality. So it was a tiny percentage of people, but the way they manipulated the numbers and the headlines just to try to suggest that there's somebody in Ireland that's in support of Irish neutrality. If you were counselling or advising anybody watching, John, in relation to whether they should speak out or not at these forums, what counsel would you give them?
I would always say to speak out. I mean, speaking for peace should be the easiest thing in the world. But unfortunately, peace has become a dirty word in Ireland. And that's a disgrace. We'll have to get away from that and get back to some sense of decency and normality.
Yeah, and I think it's happening because on a number of issues, it seems that the Irish government is getting its ass whipped in official polls. So these are official polls that the government would have often cited in the past, polling companies. So the polls are coming out completely against the government on a number of key and popular issues. And so this appears to be another one. So we'll keep a tab on that story. John, we're just going to close up, but if there was anything that you were going to focus on over the next week, you suggest that people keep an eye on, what would it be?
Well, the one big thing that we should all be keeping an eye out for is the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, because with the water now drained from the Dnieper, it'll be much easier to cross the Dnieper and attack the nuclear power plant. So that's my big worry there, because I've no doubt that what the Ukrainians are trying to do is to cause a nuclear accident at that plant. They have been shelling it for months and without any complaint from anyone. And so their intention is obviously to cause a nuclear incident because they're losing.
Yeah. And when you look at their modus operandi over the last 18 months and the extremes that they're willing to go to, the lies that they're willing to tell. And we must recall that
I don't believe that's just the Ukrainians. I believe the Ukrainians are being manipulated in the same way that you might remember the same military, what they did in the north of Ireland, telling the loyalists to do to the nationalists. It's the same over there. The British Army are involving themselves in very severe acts of terrorism over there.
Yeah. And who knows where it's going to go. I do recall that one of the previous visits of the International Atomic Agency, Energy Agency, to the Zaporizhzhia plant resulted in them being attacked by Ukrainian forces, and openly and obviously attacked by Ukrainian forces. And yet our media, like there were with Russians in the plant, visiting the plant when they were attacked. And yet our media still reported that the Russians attacked themselves and the International Atomic Energy and Agency staff. So it was all quite insane. Thanks for joining us again this week, folks. Thanks for joining us, John.
My pleasure.
And folks, we will see you next week. Please like, share, subscribe where you can. We're battling the algorithms here. We're the only Irish source of balance in terms of news coming from both Ukraine and global news as well. So please do what you can to give us a share and a like. Thank you.